You're listening to the AmWritingFantasy podcast. In today's publishing landscape, you can reach fans all over the world. Query letters are a thing of the past. You don't even need a literary agent. There is nothing standing in the way of making a living from writing. Join two best-selling authors who have self-published more than 20 books between them. Now, on to the show with your hosts, Autumn Burt and Jesper Schmidt.
Hello, I'm Jesper, and this is episode 122 of the AmWritingFantasy podcast. And Autumn is taking a break today, and instead I have a great guest for you. So I'm gonna talk to Alex Newton from K-lytics today, and welcome to the AmWritingFantasy podcast, Alex.
Hello, and thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I think I've heard you talk on so many podcasts now that your voice almost feels familiar to me.
Oh wow, I didn't realize it would be that many, but the occasional conference or webinar does happen.
Yeah, and also the nice videos you send out with K-lytics, the summarization videos. I've listened to you there many times as well. That's the funny part, right? It's like the listeners who listens to podcasts. They're also used to my and Autumn's voice. So
right.
It's
Yeah,
but,
I can imagine because, as you say, what I do usually comes with video and voiceover to explain the things because numbers can be a very dry matter. So I'll try to make it palatable, and the best way I found was with the videos and with the voice accompanying the graphs and the dry stuff.
Yeah, and that works really well. We'll get into K-lytics just in a minute, but maybe just before we get that far, maybe you could share a bit about yourself. I believe you are on my side of the Atlantic for a change. I normally always record with somebody in the US, but you're in Switzerland, is that right?
I'm based in Switzerland now. I'm a native German. I grew up in Germany. I had my professional life there as a management consultant, although there I basically worked all over the globe. And some 10 years ago, when my little daughter was born and, I had the typical corporate executive type of life, 24 hours, 7 days a week, connectivity and living out of the suitcase, I thought, hey, something should change. And that was right in that, what was it called? Like the Kindle gold rush, you could almost say. So it was almost by coincidence I got into, hey, what's Amazon doing? And then 6 years ago, I officially launched K-lytics, which, by the way, is simply Kindle and analytics, but I didn't want to get into a trademark dispute on day one, so I dropped the indle from the Kindle, and here we are with K-lytics. So right now, we've moved to Switzerland some 1.5 years back, and never looked back. So right now, I'm very much running K-lytics amongst a couple of other things, and enjoy my time here in this very nice little country that stands as a stronghold in so many aspects here right in the middle of Europe.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So you lived in Germany before then?
Yes. I grew up in the southwest of Germany and lived in Munich for many years and then near the Stuttgart area, so in the southern area of Germany.
Ah, okay. Yeah. I like watching the Bayern Munich games on television.
Except last night, right? So congratulations to Paris.
Yeah, I guess so. But you did touch a bit on it slightly there, but maybe you can explain, a bit more to those who have no idea what K-lytics is. Maybe you can put a bit more, let's say, the baseline information into what is it?
In very simple terms, we try to provide market research information to authors and publishers to help them make better publishing decisions. Now, that sounds very abstract, but if you're an author, if you are, say, in the fantasy world, and you decide about your next book project, or you're writing already you're right in the middle of a book project, and if you feel a little bit, there's a market out there, perhaps, readers and potential buyers. So if you're not just writing for therapeutic reasons, or you have nothing else to do, but because you also want to make a living with your writing, you will have to face up to the fact that you run a business, right? And any business that gets into a new product or service usually would do some kind of market research. And if it's only like talking to a couple of existing customers, or in your case, existing readers, hey, what do you like? Did this resonate with you? Now, we do this on a grander scale by basically looking at hundreds of thousands of books and their sales ranks on Amazon. And by aggregating the data from those books over time, or by certain genres, or by certain categories, we can basically deduct what is trending, what is going up, what is going down, what is selling, but what is already crowded, what is selling and perhaps not overly crowded. So we very much come into the game when people make decisions about their publishing projects. And later on, as you know, things become very tactical. In what categories can I place my book? What should be the pricing? If I do epic fantasy, what are all the other epic fantasy books being priced at? Am I too high? Am I too low? And it can get very, say, nitty-gritty and tactical then on the other side. But in essence, it is looking at what's out there in terms of data, aggregating it in an intelligible way, and then packaging it so that not every author is a mathematician, obviously, so that you can make very simple conclusions with a writing direction you take.
Yeah, and I personally really like K-lytics and the reports, but I am curious, why did you start K-lytics in the first place? Because I in the Kindle Gold Rush back then, there was nothing like this. So was it just like you thought that, well, this is missing, so I'll try to do it? Or what was the driver behind you creating K-lytics in the first place?
It was almost like half an accident that I ended up in the publishing world. Now, I did start my career in publishing, literally 30 years back in a London-based publishing company. And so there was some affinity with the publishing world. But at the point 10 years ago, when I started the first experiments, as you say, it was the Kindle Gold Rush. And it was at that time when I looked at something, hey, I want to work from home. So right now I'm clicking on all those PayPal buy buttons. Is there any way that others could click on mine? That was the onset. So I was looking into various markets, fitness market, online consulting market, information products, you name it. And almost by coincidence, I came across one of those famous, or I think by now more infamous, get rich with Kindle type of courses for the $19, these types of things. And at first I was, I was more thinking about publishing rather than writing. But having been a corporate management consultant for 25 years and having been in boardrooms 25 years, you become very conservative, meaning, I don't believe that. So you really try to look at the facts and base decisions on facts. So I started looking at Amazon sales ranks. I started to talk to people. Hey, if this whatever paleo recipe book that everybody says is like the thing, if that has a sales rank of 50,000 on Amazon, does it actually selling anything? And I found out, no, it's not selling anything. Although everybody is saying, you can get rich by uploading your grandmother's not even paleo recipe book, paleo breakfast recipe book. And at that point in time, I actually coined a term which I call to the present day the paleo breakfast recipes syndrome, meaning, people try to convince you can make money with some obscure nonfiction book upload to Kindle, which obviously is a total lie. But to the present day, people are being sold courses, to get into self-publishing and make a living by uploading your knitting patterns and that sort of thing, which is obviously complete nonsense. And so at that point in time, I started doing some almost like data experiments with Amazon, and I figured out, hey, that works. And then I was in the one or other Facebook group and started sharing. I remember my first K-lytics report was very plainly about the top 30 main Kindle categories. So essentially was looking at, is romance selling more than sci-fi and fantasy selling more than engineering and transportation books? So, like super crude level. And people tore it out of
Mm-hmm.
my hands, and then asked, "Hey, can you do this? Can you do this for subcategories?" And then people started diving into subcategories, and the rest is history. I think ever since 2015, we've been tracking more than 7,000 Kindle genres month in, month out, looking at hundreds of thousands of books.
Wow, yeah, it's impressive. I mean, you must have quite some machine power to data scrape all that information.
Well, it's not like a super large scale operation because, first of all, you don't want to. I think there can things to be said about, to what extent can and should you do automated visits on other websites. I mean, in many industries you have it, take hotel price engines and all that thing, but it's very, very small scale. So Amazon wouldn't even notice. So, and also coming more from a data science point of view, there is no value in just collecting data. The value comes with intelligent analysis and also intelligent sampling, right? We look at books like 7 days a month, like not every hour, because also, that would take bandwidth that also Amazon wouldn't be happy with. So we act more like not like the occasional visitor, but it's a very fine line between what is ethical and what isn't, right? And so we chose to do a very hands-off type of data operation that samples books rather than, as you term it, scrape the Amazon site every hour, which is not the type of business I want to get into.
No, that's fair. That's fair enough, and it's always good to be a bit ethical about what you do. Although I think with Amazon they have a scale that they know everybody. A lot of people are scraping their data, and I don't really think that they care, to be honest. But it's always good to have some ethical considerations.
Absolutely, and in the end of the day, we're there with that humble data collection to basically help their clients, that feed their whole publishing engine. So, and so far, 6 years they've never complained. I've never complained, and people people have been happy. So I hope it stays that way.
Yeah, that's perfect. So when it comes to the fantasy genre, that's sort of what we're all about here. It's also in the name of the podcast, so I guess it's quite obvious. But considering the fantasy genre, I was hoping maybe you could share a bit about your latest data and your latest trends, or sort of what you see when it comes to the fantasy genre, what is trending and so on.
I mean, first of all, the good news is that out of those big genres on Kindle, I mean, you have romance is always number one, followed by mystery, thriller, suspense. Then you have a bit of nonfiction, but usually sci-fi and fantasy. And I apologize if I make a sum with science fiction. I know many fantasy authors will say, how does Amazon dare put us in one bucket at the very top level already, which I know is not the case. But sci-fi and fantasy as one umbrella category is usually the third largest. And especially during the last 12 months of this crazy pandemic time, we've seen quite some changes in reader behavior. And the good news there is that overall, people have been looking for more. We see categories that have to do with humor have been trending up. We see very dark reads, post-apocalyptic stuff is going down. But the good news is anything that provided, say, a good escapism for readers during these dire times has, in essence, benefited. And therefore, for example, in fantasy overall, we saw a bit of a dip, obviously, about a year ago during the first lockdown periods, because there people have been buying nonfiction books about how to bake bread, and that took market share from some fiction. But very briefly, after a brief period, we saw the overall book market obviously benefiting greatly from these dire times, with print book sales in the US having shown the highest growth rates in a decade with 8% growth. Amazon grew 25% in the Kindle Select Global Fund, so the royalties paid to authors. So, I mean, 25%, that's huge. And one of the beneficiary genres was fantasy overall. As one example, if you take epic fantasy as an example, which is probably like the genre epitomizing a bit fantasy as a, I wouldn't say cliche, but as an overarching theme, what makes fantasy. The epic side of thing is obviously clearly positioned to provide an escapism. And that category on Amazon had been like, it sort of had a peak performance back in 2017, 18, around that time. And with all its fluctuations, it has then had a bit of a downward trend all the way into the start of 2020. And then after that brief dip during the first lockdown, it really shot up back again. And you see that these types of fantasy markets clearly benefited. And we can go into more if you want, but on a high level, you see that fantasy, epic fantasy, a very big market, but also very high selling. So there you could say it's a very grown, very established mainstream market in the Kindle world. And then obviously you have these hundreds of, well, not hundreds, but 10, 20 like big subgenres, from sword to sorcery, action and adventure, game adaptations. And they tend to do pretty well on the Kindle platform. So especially over the last year, all the teen young adult driven type of fantasy, we saw a lot of trends happening there. And if you want, we can, I can dig into the data here as we speak and look into some of those.
Yeah, for sure. I think that would be very interesting because a part of it is, and that's what I like with the K-lytics reports, is also to try to see, because at least, I mean, for myself and Autumn, the stuff we write, we're sort of settled in the epic fantasy world. So I think the competition is probably pretty fierce there, to be honest. But maybe you can contradict me. But I'm more thinking for, especially if you're sort of starting out and you, let's say you decided that I like to write fantasy, but I actually like very many different types of fantasy, then it could definitely also make sense to look into the K-lytics reports and try to see, okay, is there some of these subgenres where there is just less competition and it makes it a bit easier to get more sales, right? I mean, in that way, I think K-lytics is very useful, apart from what you mentioned earlier as well, that even if you are established in something, you can use it to figure out what is the good price range for books, what is the average pricing, and so on. So you position your products, so to speak, or your books correctly. But yeah, please share more details.
Right. I mean, as you mentioned it, epic fantasy, I think, is a good example of, as you say, there are established mainstream markets, and just entering in there, as a newcomer could be a bit of an uphill battle. I mean, if you look at the epic fantasy data, we did a study start of this year. That is one of the examples of well, in my corporate world, we would say a very concentrated market, right? Where a few determine the bulk of the sales, with obviously at the very top, the Brandon Sanderson, crushing it with all his books, and obviously the classics, the Tolkiens and the Robert Georgians, the obviously George R. Martin, all the fan fiction, the spin-offs, the Abercrombies of the world. And then already, even with some of the big names, whatever, what was it, like Robin Hobb, and there's a whole number of names where immediately you see the books of their sales rank. It's a tough market. Now, the good news for epic fantasy, well, good or bad news, depends on the eye of the beholder, is there, while you have like publishing companies that really dominate, like Tor Books, right, that sign on like everybody, or Orbit or DAW, there's a couple of big outfits out there, but then you do have an increasing share of indie publishers, the typical author that wants to make use of the self-publishing world and all the opportunities that come with it. And there we do see a bit of a balance between traditionally published or these specialized epic fantasy publishing houses and a couple of really good self-publishers that found their way into the game. Now, but if you don't want to get head on with the Brandon Sandersons and Tolkiens of the world, right, you will pose exactly the question. You will pose exactly the question you pose. Are there opportunities out there in the overall fantasy world where it's perhaps a bit less competitive, less crowded, less established also? And I would clearly say yes. Especially if you'd be able to also address some of the teen young adult readership, which is not necessarily teen young adult people, because obviously there's research that suggests that the bulk of the teen young adult fantasy books are actually not read necessarily by teens or young adults, but also adults. So there you have opportunities. Take the huge market of urban fantasy. By now it's also no longer a niche market, but that created a whole self-publishing sub-empire, where it's really then about, well, what type of urban fantasy do I do? Is it, the leather-clad chick that's running around with swords slaying vampires at night and working at Starbucks by day? Or am I going more into the Jim Butcher type of world? And there the data can give you hints. So, for example, we saw almost like a 5-year decline after the big Hunger Games hype was over, right? And with the pandemic, we saw with many of the teens being sitting there at home, and after the homeschooling having to do something, there's perhaps only so much Netflix you can watch, or only so many mobile devices available, that they had to read books again. I don't know. But we saw a huge increase again in some teen young adult fantasy segments. For example, these a bit dystopian type of royalty novels. Kira Kass, I think it was, primarily a driver. Obviously, there was also the Hunger Games sequel, but those were predominantly self-published authors who really took the whole segment up again. And if I just look at the data of over a year, Paranormal Fantasy has found a bit of a return. Also after years of having done well, but Paranormal, for example, the whole paranormal romance, paranormal fantasy, that has peaked, say 2013, 14. Ever since then, these waves are, by the way, very long term. When I talk about writing to market or looking at this data, this is not about monthly fluctuations. That's about catching the wave that carries you and your projects over, obviously, a period of years rather than months. So by and large, teen young adult, whether it's fantasy, fairy tales, especially in the teen young adult world, if you are a bit flexible to also put a touch of romance into it, it's selling extremely well. Fae romance, paranormal romance, vampire romance. Now, for many fantasy writers, they will go like, oh, that's like romance. I say, okay, okay, yes, I read you. But for that reader who's looking for an escape, those vampires and that stuff, or the whole thing happening in a complete fantasy world, and there's world building going into it, perhaps not as elaborate with maps and stuff as you have in a Tolkien type of trilogy, 750 pages, God knows what. But to those who are in those genres, they make a good living with it, partly, and they're not obsessed with academic definition of what constitutes fantasy and what doesn't, but basically looking at what do readers want, and then almost from a menu. Okay, best example I'd say currently is. We're about, I don't know what your age is. Yeah, yes, but we're sort of the same generation. So we know movies like the Witches of Eastwick, right? Witches of Eastwick, or then later in the late 90s, there was that other one with I think Nicole Kidman, right? So you have witches, you have housewives who in their spare time are witches. Now, right now, we have a book market getting going where some authors who've been big name authors in genres such as women's fiction, paranormal romance, urban fantasy. All these genres are getting very crowded, and cozy mystery. Now they came together, they banded together and created something which is called paranormal women's fiction. They even gave it its own hashtag, PWF. And if you look at it, it is fantasy, it is about witches, about, that shadow world. It's bringing cozy mystery, and especially what has been doing well in cozy mystery was paranormal cozy mystery, witches, right? They bring women's fiction into it because they target very specific, the authors themselves are usually like 45 and older. So they credibly write about all these midlife problems, kids gone to college, midlife depression. And they have women casts that in the urban fantasy world, overcome their midlife problems. So that's now a long monologue that I give here, but it's just to put some flesh to the bone when it comes to reading the market, looking at trends and writing to trends, but without bending yourself. That's the important thing, with what are you good at in your fantasy writing, and how can you take it and twist it in a way that you combine your love, passion, and craft with some market aspects that trend more than others. Now, there's no guarantee for success, obviously, but I think the whole publishing business has, where people do it in a professional way, it's very much become around this credo, this mantra of how do you increase the odds of success, at least if you cannot guarantee success.
Yeah, and it's so true. If one look at, especially with Amazon, I mean, Amazon is probably, well, it's good and bad in the sense that for most authors, at least, Amazon is like 90% of the income. And that is good in the sense that if you can make it work on Amazon, there is a good likelihood that you will also earn some money from it. But on the bad side, then yeah, you're completely reliant on Amazon, which that's a whole different conversation, and I don't like that too much. But let's leave that alone for now. But I think what this is really about to me is trying to find, not compromising with what you want to write. I mean, because I don't think it works if you start looking at a K-lytics report and say, oh, I can see that this subgenre is working really well and it's trending, so I'm going to write some books in that subgenre. But I don't like those kind of books. I don't read those kind of books and I don't really care about it. But I'm just going to write it because apparently that's what the readers want. I don't think that works, because it will also come across in the story that you don't really like it. And if you don't read it yourself as well, you probably don't even understand the tropes of it. So leave that alone. But I think what I'm trying more to say, and that's where I find that K-lytics is very useful. For example, when Autumn and I write our books, I know what you also said as well, that some sort of romance in the books usually works well, and probably half, or if not more than half, I think, of the readers of fantasy in general are women. So if you don't put any whatsoever, if everything is just sword fighting and dragons and whatnot, well, that can still be a great story. But if you don't put any romance in there, which the data in K-lytics also tells you is something that people like to read, you are missing out some stuff where you could gain maybe a lot more readers because you have some romance. So Autumn and I always put some romance subplots into our epic fantasy stories. There's always some romance going on in those stories. And it's more like, for me, it's one of those things where I'm okay with it. I don't love the romance subplots as such. It's not my thing, so to speak, but I don't mind either. So the question is more like, why wouldn't we put it in? I mean, Autumn likes it, so she's naturally bent towards that, and she does those things really well. That's, of course, a benefit I can enjoy, that the fact that I write books together with her, so she can put her touch on those things. So that's great for me. But yeah, my point is just to say that you can look at something like K-lytics reports and you can pick out some pieces where you feel like these are okay for me. I don't mind them. I understand them enough that I feel like I can write at least a subplot concerning it and then put that into the books. And hopefully you will see somewhat more success rather than going down your tunnel vision way of I only write this because this is the only thing I like, and everybody that doesn't like that, well, bad luck for them. And okay, fair enough if that's what you want to do. But if you want to earn some money for it as well, maybe you need to think a bit about what readers actually are looking for.
Right, and I think you couldn't have put it into a better way. And you mentioned a couple of elements there that may be worth reiterating on. I mean, the one is the love and passion for what you do. Like you say, if you don't love it yourself, if you don't love Amish romance and, could imagine writing it for the next 5 years, then don't, no matter how high it's trending, right? And the other elements that you mentioned would be, for me, also craft skill. I think there are certain genres, to write good sex scenes that are steamy but not pornographic, that is a craft skill, Not every writer is able to do so, and to do so
I wouldn't know where to begin.
Well, you tell me. Yeah. And then there's also the thing about knowledge, right? I mean, even if, during the hype times of literature, role-playing games, lit RPG, and game lit, when Spielberg took the whole thing into the mainstream movie theater, well, you had people, quarreling about, well, is in that lit RPG novel, is the scoring and the gaming element like really genuine? And I mean, if you are not a gamer yourself, the readership, the nerds, the geeks, they can smell this from like 50 miles. So don't get into it. So there's this, I always say there's this passion factor, the craft skill factor, and the knowledge factor. But where all these things come into place, I mean, even Mozart, although I think at the end of the career, it was not so shining anymore. But, even the great artists and composers, a lot of them, they worked for money, and they composed what the royalty wanted to hear, right? Not just what they had in their inspiration, So it was pop music at the point in time. So if you're in epic fantasy, and I don't know whether the word exists, but if you're hardcore epic fantasy writers, and it's swords and darkness and shadows, well, it will be good to know that themes like, if you have in your title and book description something around darkness, around shadows, around war, battles, something around ages, centuries, power, and magic, these 5 strong words, constitute like whatever 60-70% of the royalties, and books contain them. But if you say, no, I'm gonna write about whatever the golden and dungeon and the stone, the chaos and crown, these are all also, you think, very strong, compelling words, but the royalties are much lower. You get the idea. So there is certain things that at certain point in time seem to resonate with certain reader groups. And it's just bringing the arts and science a bit together and say, no problem. I have it a lot amongst my romance writers, because they can almost like on the fly, as they write the story, they can say, well, my God, if everybody currently likes mountain man, living in a cabin, and as opposed to the billionaire, or vice versa, they can very quickly change characters and move the book more into a direction that may resonate well, or they rewrite the whole book and like remarket it, where you had whatever 5 years of, I always say, back when we were young and watching black and white movies, you had women wanted to be kissed by millionaires, in Marilyn Monroe times. Today, they don't want to be kissed by millionaires. They want to be whipped by billionaires. So you had this whole 50 Shades of Grey, pretty extreme stuff. And that was like a never-ending story, but the market was getting very crowded. And all of a sudden, you had on Amazon, especially with the advertising restrictions on Amazon on very steamy content, you had a big surge, also with the age group probably of the typical Kindle device owner. In any case, clean and wholesome romance was doing extremely well. and was still more of a niche type of market. And all of a sudden, we reported on over 5 years of the trend of clean and wholesome romance. And over time, you found even some steamy authors rewrite their billionaire romance novels, their 50 Shades of Grey, into more like, clean and wholesome, clean read, sweet romance, billionaire romance, because it was simply less crowded and in high demand. And that is what I mean with like reading the market in a way where you don't bend yourself, but you just try to increase the, as you put it also, the odds of success.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's basically where you can, because it's, let me rephrase that, because it's really, really difficult to do that on your own. I mean, just try to go to Amazon and look through the different categories and try to look at the top seller list in the different categories. But it's really, really difficult for you to spot trends on your own, because it is so much data and it is so complicated that's where I really see that K-lytics can help. I mostly view K-lytics like it's an input, and then you need to unpack it yourself and say, okay, what of this can I use? And is there something where I have some sort of Venn diagram overlap between what I like to write and what the market likes to read? And then I'll try to merge those two together and make it fit there. And I think for me that's the point of it. But before we get into the end of the conversation, I wanted to also give you a chance to explain a bit what, if one buys K-lytics or goes into K-lytics, what is it that you're getting in there, and what are the reports that you're sending out and so on, and maybe also a bit about what are I think you have some tiers as well, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I was in there, but maybe just a bit of the pricing tiers and so on, if you don't mind.
But no, of course not. I mean, for those who are interested, basically, we serve authors from the fledgling interested authors to publishing houses. So we have to provide, different entry points into the product. So you can, we provide memberships and we provide single reports. Now within both, the baseline for everything is the data that we collect and that we publish every month in an updated database. And what you basically can have there are basically two big pillars to the product. The one is ready-made PDF reports. Say there's a 70-page epic fantasy report, 70 pages that comes with video that completely dissects the Amazon available data on epic fantasy. So if you're only interested in like that one genre, you can simply go to the K-lytics shop at k-lytics.com/shop. Purchase the epic fantasy report. It will keep you busy for a good week, I'd say, if you really want to absorb the data, look at the video, and especially make sense of it, of how does it fit with your writing. So that is one entry point. So you can choose what we call genre reports a la carte. There's two types of them. Ones are like really going in depth on certain subgenres, such as epic fantasy. There are others. We have a more general sci-fi and fantasy report that are not as deep in the analysis, but they are much broader, because they would comparatively look, well, there's more than 100 sci-fi and fantasy categories, and they would do exactly like we discussed before. Well, what is trending higher? Is it urban fantasy or is it paranormal? Is it? So it looks at the category data in a comparative way. So these are the types of genre reports, and you can buy them a la carte. If you are interested in more than one genre, then we recommend the memberships, because the memberships give you access to basically multiple reports at a time. And these are monthly memberships. They come in two tiers. One is premium, one is elite. Elite is the highest tiers. And the difference between the two tiers is also actually very simple. The highest tier gives you unrestricted access to everything. And one thing is all the reports. The other thing is that database. Now also premium gives you the database, but the depth of the data you see, premium basically would give you data every month for about 420 down to subcategory level. But if you want to get into also this really granular and detailed, in which 10 categories shall I put my book sort of thing, then the elite level comes handy, because there we track 7,000 categories, from the gardening and horticulture to the lowest level fantasy category that exists. Mm-hmm. So especially if you want to also look a bit what's happening across genre, because some authors are very open-minded. They write, say, urban fantasy, but they really, because they know the genres are more and more blending, they want to know what is going on in romance, what is going on in mystery, so that they keep a bit ahead of, there's a certain thing emerging. Could that come over into, like the paranormal women's fiction example I gave earlier, that is sort of the amalgamation of like 4 genre trends meeting in a certain sweet spot and meeting at a certain target reader group. And that is what we do. So there's entry points from a la carte to memberships. Obviously, we promote the memberships also price-wise, because that is what keeps us afloat and gives us the continuity to provide this research, which we've now been doing for 6 years, and hopefully many more years to come.
Oh yeah, for sure, and I definitely like to support what you're doing, because I do think it's very, very helpful, and it is stuff that authors cannot do on their own. And I definitely also support the fact that membership levels is what keeps the business going. So we know this ourselves with Patreon, for example. It's also sort of a membership site for this podcast. So it's the same thing. But at least I would say to the listeners here as well, that if you don't know if is this data thing sort of me, I would definitely recommend just start out maybe buying one of the genre reports for fantasy. I did that as well several years ago now, but I did this as well, and it's not expensive at all. I can't remember now, Alex, but I think it was like $20 maybe.
It's $37 a report, right? And you get probably more than 70 pages of analysis, all aggregated in an understandable way. So it's, as you said, as a writer, you should, of course, we know, especially as an indie writer, you have so many other business aspects to run as well. The marketing, the ads, the newsletters. There is already enough business stuff going on. To then say on top of it you want to become a market research expert may not be your core competence. So we crunch the data on hundreds of thousands of books so that you don't have to. That is the very simple essence of it.
Indeed, yes. So I will put a link to K-lytics in the show notes, so that if any of you listeners are interested to check it out a bit more, then follow that link. And on the K-lytics website, there's a lot more information as well. Hopefully we touched upon most of it, but there is explanations about what it is and what you're getting inside the report and all that stuff. So I urge you to at least go check that one out.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for coming, Alex, and speak to us here and share a bit about all this data crunching stuff.
It was a pleasure, and hey, also all the best with your podcast. I think it's great that we see also so many people in the publishing world, in the self-publishing world, for that matter, to collaborate, and have these forums where people can exchange thought. And last but not least, I'd say, of course, there's traditionally published works. There's hybrid publishers, who have, in some areas, they have their rights back. They want to go half indie. They are half traditional. And we have the, like hardcore self-publishers. And from what I've seen is, especially in that hybrid and self-publishing part of the journey, I've seen people be so fast in picking up trends, in collaborating together, that they, in some areas, they reap up whole parts of the market before the traditional publishers even know it exists as a market. So, and I think it's also thanks to these podcasts and forums like yours, where these thoughts are exchanged and transported to the community, that make that happen.
But okay, thank you so much for coming here, Alex. And next Monday, I will have Autumn back here, and we are going to do one of our monthly fun episodes where we are going to discuss the top 10 worst and scariest fantasy worlds.
If you like what you just heard, there's a few things you can do to support the AmWritingFantasy podcast. Please tell a fellow author about the show and visit us at Apple Podcast and leave a rating and review. You can also join Autumn and Jesper on patreon.com/AmWritingFantasy. For as little as $1 a month, You'll get awesome rewards and keep the Am Writing Fantasy podcast going. Stay safe out there and see you next Monday.